we asked our students, some of them are here, are you a creative person? It's like, well, I don't know how to draw. I don't know how to do this. I don't know. We're all creative. And then Adam said, have you seen this book on creativity? And I said, no, but where'd you find it? He says, it's on Amazon. So I pick it up and I'm reading it. And it's like, wow, this is really good. And then I look, it's written by this guy, Angus Fletcher. So I go on LinkedIn like we all do. And I'm like, he works at Ohio State. I'm like, how cool is that? So, of course, I call him up. He immediately takes my call, and we develop the relationship. I'm going to read to you some of the things from his bio because I don't want to get it wrong, and it's extremely impressive. He's a professor of story science at OSU's Project Narrative. Okay? This is the world's largest leading academic think tank for the study of how stories work. So who better to start us off than Angus? But there's more. Have you heard of Brene Brown? Have you heard of Malcolm Gladwell? Well, hold on. I know, Acacia, I probably should have had something different. But anyways, so Malcolm refers to his work as mind-blowing, okay? Brene Brown refers to his work as life-changing. He also received the Medal of Commendation from the U.S. Army for his work with, in part, the Army Nurse Corps. So please give him a big Buckeye welcome to Angus Fletcher.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to hand you back the mic. And thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm going to start us off by telling a story of gratitude about how nurses changed my life. It starts about 10 years ago, just before the birth of my first child, and I was a little anxious. A little anxious about the birth of my first child. Now, it's normal to be anxious about the birth of your first child, but my anxiety was a little unusual. And I noticed that as we got to the hospital, my blood pressure was rising. I was having a hard time focusing. I was having a hard time concentrating. Then somehow, my wife gives birth, and she turns to me, and she says to me, Angus, since you've been doing so much, standing in the corner hyperventilating, would you mind going out and picking me up some dinner? My favorite restaurant is just right around the corner. I would really appreciate it if you could go get me a meal. And when she said that to me, you know what I did? I sat down on a chair and I stared into the distance. I did, yeah. No, I won Husband of the Year for that award. So anyway, my wife, after looking at me standing there staring out the window, she picks up the phone and calls the hospital cafeteria, and that was her celebratory meal. So naturally, she assumed that once we got home, my behavior would improve. It did not. I was incapable of changing the baby's diaper. I was incapable of doing basic things. And then this very odd behavior surfaced, which is that the moment that I put my child down to sleep, I would myself be unable to sleep. I would go to bed, and I would start to have these terrible nightmares, and I would get up. And I kept having this memory again and again in my mind. And I knew that for the sake of my daughter and for the sake of my family, I needed to get help, but I couldn't. For some reason, I couldn't tell this story. And this was strange and embarrassing for me, shameful really, to admit, because at the time, a big part of my job was working with nurses to help other people get help. So I was working with nurses to help veterans and to help survivors of abuse. And a big part of our work was the healing power of surfacing your story and talking about those memories, those parts of your life that cause you shame, that cause you grief, that are hard to recall, and opening up and telling them to the people that you care about. And as we were doing that work, we discovered the importance of a technique which you're going to see tonight. And the technique was what we called the resilience story. And what we discovered is that when people were able to tell themselves a story of a time that they had moved from sorrow into joy, and they were able to think that story to themselves over and over and over again, it made their brain believe deeply that they could heal, because the brain had lived that story. And it wasn't somebody else's story. It was their own story. And that story always had two parts. The first was an outside event, something that had happened, a death, a diagnosis. But the second part was the internal response, the way the person reacted. And in that moment of reaction and remembering that moment, the brain developed confidence and belief in its ability to react again. And so what I've started out tonight by telling you is the first part of my resilience story. The first part where I felt like I couldn't help myself, like I felt like I couldn't react, like I felt like it was too big for me. And what changed in my life is when I was working with veterans and a member of the Army Nurse Corps pulled me aside and she said to me, she said, "Who takes care of the caregivers?" And I thought at that time she was talking about herself. But I realized she was talking about me. And I realized that she had seen in me the thing I didn't want to admit about myself, which is that I was struggling. And with her help, I was able to tell the story to her and then to my family that I just told to you earlier. And when I told that story to her, it produced a radical transformation in my life. I'm not going to pretend I became a great husband. I'm not going to pretend that I always do everything perfectly. But I knew that my life had changed 2 years ago when my children came up to me, aged 8 and 5, and asked if they could be the only children on our block to walk themselves to school. And the old me would have been terrified. But the new me realized that they could take care of themselves. And I can tell you one of the happiest moments of my life was when they came back from the first day of walking themselves to school. And I was practically in tears, and I was so impressed with them. And they said to me, "Whatever, Dad. It's just 2 blocks." So that's my story of how a nurse helped me surface my resilience narrative. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to the nurses who I know are going to help you surface yours.